More than 20 Russian tanks and armored vehicles were stopped in a single mechanized push near Pokrovsk, with several vehicles hit before they ever reached the front line under Ukrainian drone strikes, mines, and artillery fire. This was not a routine clash on a crowded map, but a sharp signal that Moscow is returning to large-scale mechanized assaults after months of slow and costly infantry fighting, even as the battlefield above is saturated with drones. The attack focused on the village of Shakov, at a moment when Pokrovsk has become a critical defensive hinge that shields deeper routes toward Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, which means any movement in this area carries weight far beyond one settlement. If Russia manages to break through near Pokrovsk, pressure could spread across the central Donetsk front and force Ukraine to adjust defenses along multiple axes. But if these armored thrusts keep getting cut apart at long range, the cost may be far higher than the ground gained, pushing Russia closer to burning through its remaining stocks of armored vehicles without changing the balance. This story is not about who holds a single village today. It is about how modern warfare is being reshaped in real time, and why tanks are still being sent forward, even when the odds of survival are shrinking under constant aerial surveillance. The open question now is whether this failed assault marks the end of a risky gamble, or the first step in a wider escalation around Pokrovsk that neither side is ready to stop. Russia returned to a mechanized assault near Pokrovsk with a clear battlefield sequence in mind, and that sequence began with armored movement designed to carry infantry across exposed ground under constant Ukrainian drone watch. More than 20 vehicles moved out as part of this push, including T-80B VM tanks and BTR-82A armored carriers, forming columns meant to advance quickly through open areas where foot movement had repeatedly failed. The vehicles did not rush blindly, but rolled forward with infantry already mounted, because the first minutes of movement were expected to draw fire from UAV-guided artillery and FPV teams. As the columns advanced, Ukrainian drones were already in the air, tracking movement and relaying positions, which meant the armored push was operating under immediate observation rather than surprise. Despite this, the vehicles pressed forward, using speed and mass to shorten the time spent in open terrain, since lingering in place would almost guarantee strikes from above. The goal at this stage was not to fight Ukrainian armor, but to reach terrain features such as tree lines, shallow depressions, and damaged structures where infantry could dismount and spread out. Inside the BTRs, troops stayed mounted as long as possible, because dismounting too early would expose them to drone-dropped munitions and indirect fire before any cover could be reached. The tanks moved alongside the carriers, not as independent attackers, but as protection against sudden engagements, while also drawing attention that might divert fire from the infantry vehicles. As the columns closed the distance, the first vehicles began to slow under pressure, either due to damaged roads, minor strikes, or the need to adjust spacing once contact was expected. This loss of pace quickly became dangerous, because slowed or stopped vehicles created visual markers that helped Ukrainian FPV operators fix targets. When the lead elements hesitated, following vehicles were forced to compress or reroute, which reduced dispersion and increased vulnerability from the air. Some vehicles attempted to push through these moments of pressure, while others paused just long enough to assess whether the route ahead remained passable. This hesitation marked the turning point of the assault, because once momentum faltered, Ukrainian fire began to land closer and with greater accuracy. At that stage, the armored push shifted from forward movement to survival, with crews focused on avoiding direct hits rather than maintaining formation. Infantry inside the vehicles faced a narrow choice, because staying mounted risked being struck, while dismounting too early meant exposure in terrain still under drone observation. In several cases, troops dismounted near cover as vehicles halted or maneuvered, using the nearby forest as temporary shields while moving toward tree lines. However, the intended flow of the assault never fully formed, since repeated interruptions prevented a clean handoff from armored movement to infantry advance. As pressure increased, the columns lost coherence, with some vehicles pulling back while others attempted to hold position long enough to extract troops. This breakdown forced a gradual withdrawal, not in a single order, but as a series of local decisions made under fire. The assault ended without the columns reaching the main defensive line, and the movement reversed before a sustained foothold could be established. What unfolded near Pokrovsk was therefore not a sudden collapse, but a step-by-step erosion of momentum driven by early detection, constant aerial pressure, and the narrow margins armored units now face when moving under a hostile sky. Russian forces prepared this assault in advance near Malinivka, and the preparation followed a clear sequence that aimed to protect the approach before the main columns ever moved. Observation posts were set up around the staging area with the task of spotting Ukrainian UAV activity early, since drones had repeatedly disrupted movement in this sector before vehicles could even roll forward. These positions were meant to watch the sky and the ground at the same time, scanning for reconnaissance flights that usually signal incoming artillery or FPV strikes. Alongside this, armored vehicles were not kept in one tight assembly point, but were pushed out earlier into tree lines and village edges to reduce the visual pattern that drones often pick up. Some tanks and carriers sat under partial cover for hours, waiting for the moment when the attack order would come, while engines stayed cold to limit heat signatures. This dispersal was designed to delay detection and to allow the columns to form closer to the start line, rather than moving out in one obvious wave. The first movement, however, did not go unnoticed. Ukrainian reconnaissance drones were already airborne and began tracking unusual shifts in vehicle positions around Malinivka, long before the assault columns fully assembled. Once this movement was flagged, the information flow moved quickly, with drone feeds passed to artillery units and FPV teams that were already positioned to respond. The result was that the preparation phase itself became contested ground, rather than a quiet buildup before contact. As some vehicles adjusted positions inside tree lines, artillery fire began to land nearby, forcing crews to either stay put or move again under pressure. FPV drones were then directed toward vehicles that had broken cover or slowed while changing routes, turning small adjustments into exposure windows. Several armored platforms were struck during this phase, not as part of a dramatic clash, but through steady pressure that chipped away at the force before it could align. This early contact disrupted spacing, since crews became more cautious and increased distance between vehicles, which slowed coordination across the area. Other drivers reacted in the opposite way and tried to reposition faster, which briefly raised noise and visual signatures that further helped Ukrainian tracking. The preparation zone thus shifted from a protected rear area into a shallow engagement space where every move carried risk. Commanders still pushed forward with the plan, but the rhythm had already changed because time spent avoiding strikes reduced the margin for a clean launch. The intent had been to form two coherent columns shortly before movement, yet the pressure forced piecemeal adjustments that delayed that moment. By the time the assault phase approached, Ukrainian fire had already tested routes, measured response times, and marked likely paths of advance. Vehicles that survived the preparation stage rolled out with crews fully aware that their positions were no longer hidden, which shaped how cautiously they moved. The early detection also influenced infantry behavior, since troops stayed mounted longer while waiting for clearer signs that the route ahead was still usable. This early exposure did not decide the outcome by itself, but it set the conditions that made later movement harder, riskier, and far less flexible once the columns finally pushed forward. The collapse of the advance routes between Malinivka and Shakov began once Ukrainian UAVs and mine-dropping drones reshaped those roads into controlled danger zones rather than simple paths forward. As Russian vehicles moved onto these routes, surveillance drones stayed overhead and tracked each shift in speed and spacing, which meant the columns were visible almost from the moment they committed to the approach. Mine-dropping drones worked ahead of the vehicles, placing explosives along likely lines of movement and forcing drivers to slow down or change direction under pressure. This combination turned forward motion into a series of tests, because every adjustment increased exposure time and raised the chance of being fixed by fire. When the first vehicles encountered obstacles or detonations, momentum slipped immediately, since even a brief stop created a reference point for Ukrainian FPV teams. Once a single tank or carrier slowed, the following vehicles had to react, either by compressing the formation or by diverting onto less prepared ground. Both choices carried risk, because tighter spacing invited precision strikes, while detours exposed vehicles to hidden mines and poor terrain. As hits accumulated, the rhythm of the assault broke apart, since coordinated movement depends on steady pace and predictable intervals. Crews that were forced to halt focused on survival tasks, such as scanning for drones and maneuvering for cover, rather than pushing forward. Infantry inside the carriers remained mounted longer than planned, waiting for a clear moment to dismount that never fully arrived. Some troops exited near the edges of the road when vehicles stalled, using hulls as temporary shields while moving toward shallow cover. As a result, the force did not build pressure through numbers, but fragmented into small groups reacting to local threats. The routes themselves became the core problem, because roads that once offered speed now acted as funnels that concentrated attention and fire. Ukrainian operators used this predictability to strike from distance, often without direct contact between ground forces. FPV drones hunted vehicles that paused too long, while artillery followed patterns already mapped during earlier reconnaissance. Each strike further discouraged movement, since crews understood that restarting after a stop was more dangerous than pressing through. Attempts to regain tempo failed, because the mine threat limited acceleration and forced careful steering even under fire. By this stage, the advance routes no longer supported offensive movement, but imposed decisions that favored defense and withdrawal. The loss of continuous pressure meant Ukrainian units did not need to rush reinforcements or expose themselves in close combat. Instead, they could let drones and indirect fire do the work, striking targets already fixed by terrain and timing. As vehicles pulled back or held position, the idea of a sustained push along these axes collapsed. What remained was a scattered presence of armor and infantry along roads that had become liabilities rather than assets. The failure of these routes was not caused by one decisive strike, but by layered control that denied freedom of movement step by step. By the time the assault reached its furthest point, the paths between Malinivka and Shakov had fully shifted from corridors of advance into zones of attrition. This transformation explains why the mechanized push lost force without ever reaching a decisive clash, because the battle was decided on the roads long before any frontline engagement could take shape. The issue of losses became visible as the assault slowed and then reversed, because claims about destroyed vehicles and damaged columns began to shape how the battle was understood beyond the field itself. Ukraine stated that Russian armored units suffered heavy losses during the push, with multiple vehicles hit before reaching the main defensive line. Yet these figures came from one side actively engaged in the fight. Such claims emerged quickly after contact, following footage from drones that showed strikes on moving and halted vehicles along the approach routes. In this phase, numbers started to travel faster than troops, because images of burning armor carry strong weight even when full verification is still incomplete. This does not mean the reports are false, but it does mean they reflect a battlefield view filtered through operational goals and morale needs. Modern combat makes this unavoidable, since every strike recorded from above becomes part of the narrative almost instantly. While exact counts remain contested, the pattern of damage is harder to dispute, because the assault did not reach its intended objectives and did not establish a foothold near the defensive belt. Vehicles that were struck or disabled forced others to halt or divert, which increased exposure and added to the sense of mounting loss. As movement slowed, the balance shifted away from offensive action and toward damage control, which is often where perception begins to matter as much as ground gained. Russian units responded by pulling back in stages, extracting what they could while avoiding deeper entanglement under constant observation. The flow of information during this period shaped how the engagement was framed, because Ukrainian releases emphasized disruption and denial rather than total destruction. From the Russian side, silence or limited acknowledgement left space for these narratives to dominate early understanding of the clash. In modern warfare, that silence carries its own cost, because absence of counterclaims allows one version of events to set the initial tone. Still, even without exact tallies, the operational result is clear, because the mechanized thrust did not cross the final approach and did not force Ukrainian units to reposition their main defenses. Losses, therefore, must be read not only in burned hulls, but in lost time, broken tempo, and abandoned routes. Each damaged vehicle reduced the ability to apply pressure, since mechanized assaults rely on continuity rather than isolated bursts of movement. As the column thinned and spacing widened, the attack lost its ability to threaten depth, which made further advance impractical. At that point, continuing forward would have risked greater exposure without improving chances of success. This is where information and battlefield reality meet, because claims of heavy losses are reinforced by the visible absence of progress. The result was an operation that ended short of its goal and shifted into disengagement before contact with the main defensive line. This outcome matters more than any single number, because it shows that the push failed to change control of space. Even if some vehicles survived, the assault as a whole did not achieve its purpose and was forced to yield initiative. In that sense, the battle around Pokrovsk was decided not by headline figures, but by the simple fact that the advance stopped and then pulled back under pressure. That reality anchors the broader narrative, regardless of how losses are counted or presented in the information space. Russian forces entered this phase of the assault already moving, and the first sign of adaptation appeared along the approach routes as armored vehicles advanced with improvised anti-drone armor visibly mounted on their frames. Columns rolled forward with tanks and carriers fitted with metal cages and added panels, and these modified vehicles led the movement toward Shakov as crews prepared to cross exposed ground under constant threat from above. As the advance began, infantry remained mounted, and engines stayed at speed, because the plan depended on momentum rather than caution to shorten the time spent in open terrain. Ukrainian drones were already airborne, tracking the columns as they formed and moved, marking speed, spacing, and direction from the first kilometers of movement. FPV drones soon followed, closing in as vehicles pushed forward, and while some strikes were disrupted by the added armor, others still found weak points, striking tracks, rear sections, and exposed components. Despite these hits, the columns did not stop immediately, and crews continued forward, betting that movement itself offered better odds than halting under observation. Inside the carriers, infantry stayed mounted longer than planned, watching the terrain pass by while waiting for a moment when dismounting would not mean immediate exposure. That moment rarely came cleanly. As mines appeared along the routes and near road edges, drivers slowed, adjusted steering, or paused briefly to avoid suspected danger zones, and those small changes began to break the rhythm of the advance. Artillery fire followed soon after, landing in areas where vehicles hesitated or clustered, forcing crews to choose between pushing through fire or stopping to reassess. When the first vehicles slowed or stalled, following units compressed or diverted, and the formation lost its earlier shape. Infantry began dismounting under pressure, exiting vehicles near tree lines or shallow cover, using the armored hulls as temporary shields while moving away from the roads. These dismounts were not synchronized across the formation, but happened in short bursts, driven by local conditions rather than a coordinated plan. Some vehicles continued forward after unloading troops, while others pulled back damaged or immobilized, leaving gaps that further disrupted movement. FPV drones exploited these moments, striking vehicles that paused too long while artillery continued to work the same corridors, reinforcing the sense that the routes themselves had become hostile spaces. As the push continued, added armor bought moments rather than security, allowing vehicles to survive initial contact but not to regain control of the tempo. Crews maneuvered constantly, steering around obstacles, reversing under fire, or shifting position to avoid repeated targeting. Commanders faced shrinking options as the assault unfolded, because committing more armor risked heavier exposure, while pulling back conceded the initiative already lost. By this stage, the assault no longer resembled a breakthrough attempt, but a series of local actions aimed at limiting damage and stabilizing the situation. Modified vehicles continued to appear along the routes, but their presence did not reverse the trend, as UAV surveillance, mines, and indirect fire continued to work together. The push ended without reaching its intended objectives, leaving damaged armor, dispersed infantry, and abandoned routes behind. The mechanized assault near Pokrovsk sends a sharp signal, because the war in Ukraine is now defined by a direct clash between armor and drones, with no safe margin left once large units begin to move. What happened around Shakov shows how tanks can still carry troops forward, but only under constant risk, while the low sky decides when that movement slows, breaks, or stops entirely. Russia accepted vehicle losses to search for momentum, pushing armored columns into zones already watched from above, hoping speed could still create pressure on the ground. Ukraine responded by letting drones, mines, and artillery do most of the work, fixing and fragmenting those pushes before close combat became necessary. This balance did not produce a clean breakthrough or a dramatic collapse, but it revealed a new normal where movement itself is the most dangerous phase of the fight. Will Moscow keep escalating around Pokrovsk, commit more armor, and accept heavier losses to force a shift? Or will the rising cost push commanders toward a different approach? The next moves around Pokrovsk may not give clear answers, but they will show which side adapts faster to a battlefield that watches everything. Share thoughts in the comments. Like the video, share it with others who follow modern warfare, and subscribe to Military Force for more clear reporting on real battles, modern weapons, and the politics behind them.